The great chamber of the Galactic Assembly stretched for miles in every direction, and its curved walls glowed with the light of 1,000 different species who had come together to decide the fate of worlds. And at this moment, every single one of them was afraid. Ambassador Kethrol of the Vishari Collective stood at the central platform, his blue bioluminescent skin pulsing with colors that showed his deep worry. And he raised his forearms to call for silence. From the massive crowd that filled the chamber like a living ocean of alien forms. "Fellow delegates," he announced in a voice that the translation systems carried to every corner of the vast room. "We have received a formal request for membership in the Galactic Union from a new species, and they call themselves humanity, and they come from a small planet called Earth in the Sol System." The reaction was immediate and terrifying to witness species that had not agreed on anything for 10,000 years suddenly found common ground in their fear. And the Cathori delegates wrapped their tentacles around themselves in a gesture of protection. And the Velmathi shifted their crystalline bodies into defensive formations. And even the mighty Drogoth warriors, who feared nothing in the known universe, lowered their massive heads and refused to meet anyone's eyes. Young delegate Yenara watched all of this with complete confusion, and she could not understand why her elders were acting this way. And she had studied the files on humanity for many weeks before this assembly, and nothing in those files had prepared her for this reaction. She was barely 120 years old, which made her almost a child by the standards of most galactic species. And she had been chosen for this position because of her sharp mind and her ability to see things that others missed. And right now she was seeing something that made no sense at all. The humans were not impressive by any measure that mattered in galactic politics, and their technology was primitive compared to even the youngest species in the Union. And their ships could barely travel faster than light, and they had no weapons that could threaten a proper warship. And they had only recently discovered that they were not alone in the universe. So, why were the oldest and wisest beings in the galaxy acting like someone had just announced the return of the Void Plague? High Arbiter Zolmanthi rose from his seat at the head of the council, and his body was made of living crystal that had formed over millions of years. And light passed through him in ways that created rainbows across the chamber floor. And he was the oldest being that anyone had ever met. And he had watched 17 civilizations rise to greatness and fall to dust. "We must vote against admission," he said. And his voice was like the sound of wind moving through ancient caves. "And we must do this not out of cruelty or prejudice, but for the survival of everything we have built." Yenara could not stay silent any longer, and she stood up from her seat among the junior delegates. And she knew that speaking out of turn was a serious breach of protocol. But she did not care. "High Arbiter," she called out, and her voice was strong despite her fear. "I must ask why we are so afraid of this species, because I have read every file we have on them, and they seem completely unremarkable." The chamber went silent, and every eye and sensor and perception organ turned toward the young delegate who had dared to question the council. "They live for less than 100 years," Yenara continued, and she pulled up holographic displays that showed human biology. "And their bodies are fragile and easily damaged, and they have no natural weapons like claws or venom or armored skin. And they cannot even survive in vacuum without artificial protection." She waved her tentacle through the display, bringing up more data. "Their planet has extreme temperature variations that would kill most species. And they fight among themselves constantly. And they have no unified government. And they have nearly destroyed their own world multiple times through pollution and war." Yenara looked around the chamber at all the frightened faces. With respect to the council, these creatures sound more pathetic than dangerous, and I do not understand why we would deny them membership based on fear. The silence stretched on for a long moment, And then High Arbiter Zolmanthi did something that Yanara had never seen him do before. He laughed. It was not a happy sound, and it echoed through the chamber like the cracking of glaciers. And it made Yanara's skin crawl with sudden dread. "Young delegate," the High Arbiter said, and his voice was gentle in a way that somehow made it more frightening. "You have just listed all the reasons why humanity is the most dangerous species this galaxy has ever produced." He gestured with one crystalline limb, and the chamber systems responded to his command. And suddenly, the walls were filled with images and videos and documents that Yanara had never seen before. "Everything you described as weakness is actually strength," the High Arbiter explained. "And everything you see as pathetic is actually terrifying. And you do not understand this because you are young and you have never met a predator species." Yanara felt her hearts begin to beat faster. Their short lives make them desperate and driven in ways that long-lived species cannot comprehend. And their fragile bodies have made them creative and cunning and willing to use any tool or weapon or trick to survive. And their harsh planet has bred them for struggle and hardship and conflict. The High Arbiter paused, and his light dimmed in a way that suggested deep sorrow. 50 cycles ago, the Zenthari Dominion made first contact with humanity, and the Zenthari were the greatest conquerors the galaxy had ever known. And they had never lost a war in 2,000 years of expansion. He turned to face Yanara directly. "Would you like to know what happened to them?" Yanara nodded, even though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to refuse. And she realized that she was about to learn something that would change the way she understood the universe forever. "Then I will unseal the classified archives," the High Arbiter said, "and you will read what the Zenthari learned about humanity. And you will understand why we are afraid." The chamber systems hummed as ancient security protocols were overridden, and files that had been locked away for 50 years began to open. And Yanara walked toward the display terminal with legs that trembled beneath her. She began to read, and as the words filled her mind, she felt the color drain from her skin. And she finally understood why the galaxy feared the small fragile creatures from the planet called Earth. The first file was titled Initial Invasion Assessment, and it was written by a Zenthari commander named Rethax. And his confidence and arrogance filled every line. "This will be the easiest conquest in Dominion history," he had written. And Yanara could almost hear his smug satisfaction through the translation. She scrolled down to the final entry in his file, written 10 years later, and it contained only 3 words before his death was recorded. "We were wrong." 50 cycles before the Galactic Assembly would debate humanity's fate, Commander Vreth-Ax of the Zenthari Dominion stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked down at the pale blue world below with complete contempt in his 4 eyes. This planet was called Earth by its inhabitants, and it was a small and unremarkable world orbiting a small and unremarkable star in a region of space that nobody had ever bothered to explore before. And the only reason Vreth-Ax had come here at all was because a scout ship had detected radio signals coming from this system. "Report," Vreth-Ax commanded, and his voice was deep and harsh like the grinding of stones. His science officer, a thin and nervous Zenthari named Kethvos, pulled up holographic displays that showed everything they had learned about the planet and its dominant species. "They call themselves humans, Commander, and they have achieved basic space travel within their own system. And they have primitive nuclear weapons. And they have sent unmanned probes to nearby planets." Vreth-Ax made a sound of dismissal. "What about their military capabilities?" "Their military technology is approximately 2,000 years behind our own, Commander, and they have no energy weapons. And they have no shields. And they have no ships capable of interstellar travel without our help." The science officer hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There is one thing that concerns me, Commander, and that is their lack of unified government. Because the planet is divided into nearly 200 separate nations, and they constantly fight among themselves over resources and territory and beliefs. Rethax laughed, and it was a cruel sound that echoed through the bridge. You think this is a concern? This is a gift. A divided species cannot mount a proper defense, and they will be too busy fighting each other to fight us, and we will conquer them one nation at a time. He turned to his tactical officer. How long to secure the planet? 3 rotations at most, Commander, and that estimate is generous. Excellent, Rethax said, and he sat back in his command chair with complete confidence. Begin the invasion, and let us add another world to the Dominion's glory. The Zenthari fleet descended upon Earth like a plague of metal locusts, and their ships darkened the skies over 100 cities at once, and their soldiers poured out of dropships in endless waves of chitin armor and plasma weapons. The Zenthari were perfect soldiers by every measure that mattered, and each one stood 8 feet tall on 4 powerful legs, and they had 4 arms that could tear through steel, and their bodies were covered in natural armor that could stop most projectile weapons. And they had been bred for war over millions of years of evolution. They expected the humans to surrender immediately, because that was what every other species in the galaxy had done when faced with the Dominion's overwhelming force. And surrender was the logical response when the mathematics of defeat became certain. First sign that something was wrong came from a small farming community in a place called Kansas. A squad of Zenthari soldiers landed in a field of tall golden plants and began marching toward the nearest settlement. And they moved with the confidence of predators who had never known fear. And they did not even bother to activate their shields because they did not believe these primitives could hurt them. An old human male came out of a wooden structure holding a primitive projectile weapon, and the squad leader made a gesture that meant surrender or die. In the Dominion's combat language, the old human raised his weapon and fired 3 times, and the squad leader fell dead with 3 small pieces of metal buried in his eye cluster, and the old human was vaporized a moment later by plasma fire. But the damage was done. Zenthari had expected surrender, and instead they had found someone willing to die just to take one of them with him. This scene repeated itself across the planet in the first hour of the invasion, and farmers with ancient weapons and children with improvised explosives and elderly humans with nothing but kitchen knives threw themselves at the Zenthari forces with no regard for their own survival. In a city called Tokyo, a group of office workers armed themselves with chairs and scissors and attacked a Zenthari patrol, and they killed 2 soldiers before being wiped out, and their faces showed no fear as they died. In a city called Lagos, an old woman walked up to a Zenthari command unit with her hands raised in apparent surrender, and she smiled at them as she detonated the explosives hidden under her clothing. And the blast killed her and 7 Zenthari officers. Commander Rethax received report after report of similar incidents, and his confidence began to crack like ice under pressure, and he demanded explanations from his advisors. Why are they fighting? He screamed at his officers. We have orbital superiority. We have destroyed their military bases. They cannot possibly win. His tactical officer had no answer, because none of this made any sense by Zenthari standards of war. The Dominion had conquered 40 star systems and hundreds of species, and some of those species had been far more advanced than humanity, and some had weapons that could crack planets and shields that could stop stars, and every single one of them had surrendered when victory became impossible. But the humans did not seem to understand that victory was impossible. Or perhaps they understood and simply did not care. On the 3rd day of the invasion, Commander Rethax received a transmission from a human military leader, and he accepted the call, expecting a surrender negotiation. Instead, a tired and bloody human face appeared on his screen, And the human smiled with teeth that looked disturbingly like those of a predator. "You've taken our cities," the human said. And his voice was calm, despite the sounds of explosions in the background. "Good luck holding them. Because we will see you in the rubble. You cannot win," Rethax replied. "The mathematics are clear, and your species will be extinct if you continue to resist. So I offer you one chance to surrender and save your people." The human laughed, and it was not a sound of despair or madness, but genuine amusement. "You think we don't know we're losing? We know, and we don't care, because we've been losing wars since the beginning of our history. And we've learned that losing a battle is not the same as losing a war." The human leaned closer to the camera. "You have better weapons and better ships and better soldiers. And that's true, but we have something you don't have. And that's the willingness to fight for years, for decades, for generations if necessary." "That is madness," Rethax said. "No," the human replied. "That is humanity, and you made a terrible mistake coming to our world. And you're going to learn why every predator on our planet learned to fear us. Because we are the species that hunted everything else to extinction." The transmission ended, and Commander Rethax felt something he had never felt before in his long career of conquest. He felt afraid the war was only beginning, and everything he thought he knew about conquest and submission and the mathematics of war was about to be proven wrong. The humans were going to teach the Zenthari Dominion a lesson that the galaxy would never forget. The biology of terror, 3 cycles into the occupation of Earth. The Zenthari High Command was in complete chaos, and admirals and generals who had never known defeat were screaming at each other in endless meetings. And no one could explain how a primitive species was making fools of the greatest military in galactic history. Scientist Zenthari had been pulled from her comfortable laboratory on the Dominion homeworld and sent to Earth with a simple mission: study the humans and explain why they were so difficult to conquer. She had been given complete access to captured humans for study, and she had analyzed their biology and their psychology and their history. And what she found terrified her more than anything she had ever encountered in her 300 years of scientific work. Her report to High Command began with a classification that most Zenthari had never heard. The humans, she wrote, are pursuit predators. And this classification is so rare in the galaxy that most species consider it mythological. And I now believe that our failure to recognize this immediately is the reason we are losing this war. The assembled commanders looked at her with confusion, and she explained, "Most predator species in the galaxy use one of 2 hunting strategies. And the first is ambush predation, where the predator hides and waits for prey to come close before striking. And the second is speed predation, where the predator runs faster than the prey and catches it quickly." She pulled up images of human ancestors on the display. Humans use neither of these strategies, and instead they developed a third approach that is almost unique in known biology. They follow their prey at a moderate pace until the prey literally dies from exhaustion. The commanders made sounds of disbelief. "That is impossible," one admiral said. "No creature can catch prey by being slower than it." "You are wrong," Zenthari replied. "And the humans call this persistence hunting. And it works because humans have biological adaptations that allow them to regulate their body temperature through sweating. And they can run for hours without overheating. And they can carry water with them over long distances." She showed them videos recovered from human historical archives. Videos of humans chasing large animals across vast plains for days at a time until the animals simply collapsed and could not run anymore. Their prey was always faster, she explained. But speed does not matter when your predator never stops following you. And it does not matter how many times you escape if the predator just keeps coming. She paused to let this sink in. This evolutionary strategy has shaped everything about human psychology. And they are designed for long conflicts, and they do not understand quick surrender. And they measure wars in years and decades and generations rather than days and weeks. The commanders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But surely their bodies are fragile. One general said, "Our soldiers have reported that humans die from wounds that would be minor for us. Their bodies are fragile compared to ours." Zenthari agreed. "But their bodies also produce natural combat drugs that we cannot replicate in our laboratories." She brought up biological data on the display. When humans experience fear or anger or excitement, their bodies flood with chemicals called adrenaline and cortisol and endorphins. And these chemicals suppress pain and increase strength and sharpen focus. And they allow humans to fight through injuries that should be incapacitating. She showed them combat footage from the invasion. "We have recorded cases of humans continuing to fight with severed limbs. And we have recorded cases of humans absorbing plasma burns that should have killed them instantly and still managing to return fire. And we have recorded cases of humans who were clinically dead by our medical standards continuing to function for several minutes." "That is not possible," an admiral whispered. "It is possible," Zenthari replied, "because their bodies were designed for a world where giving up meant death. And their biology simply does not allow for easy surrender." She moved to the final section of her report, and her voice became quieter. "But the most dangerous thing about humans is not their endurance or their pain tolerance. And it is something that has no equivalent in Zenthari psychology. And we have no word for it in our language." She paused, searching for the right way to explain. "The humans call it love." The commanders made sounds of confusion. And Zenthari continued, "Humans form irrational emotional attachments to other beings. And these attachments can extend to family and friends and comrades. And they can even extend to complete strangers or to abstract concepts like freedom or home." She showed them more footage. Footage of humans dying to protect other humans. Footage of humans running into certain death to rescue wounded comrades. Footage of humans fighting with desperate fury when their families were threatened. When a human loves something or someone, they become willing to die for that thing without hesitation. And they become capable of acts of violence that exceed anything we have seen from any other species. She looked around the room at the silent commanders. A human soldier does not fight because they are ordered to fight. And they do not fight because surrender is tactically unwise. And they fight because they love the humans behind them, and they would rather die than let those humans be harmed. She brought up her final analysis. "We cannot defeat this psychology with weapons. And we cannot break these bonds with torture or threats. And every time we kill a human, we create 10 more humans who now have someone to avenge." She closed her display. "My recommendation is immediate withdrawal from this planet. Because we are not fighting an army, and we are not even fighting a species. And we are fighting an evolutionary strategy that has spent millions of years learning how to win against superior opponents. They do not fear death," she concluded. "And they fear only failing the people they love. And that fear makes them more dangerous than any weapon we possess." The High Command voted against withdrawal because they could not accept that the mighty Dominion could lose to such a primitive species. And this decision would prove to be the greatest mistake in Zenthari history. The humans had shown the Zenthari that they would not surrender. And now they would show them something far worse. They would show them what humans could do when they had something to fight for. By the 5th cycle of the occupation, something impossible was happening on the small blue world called Earth. And the Zenthari Dominion, which had never lost a war in 2,000 years of galactic conquest, was losing to a species that had not even achieved. Faster-than-light travel Commander Vrethax had been replaced 3 times by this point, and each new commander had arrived with promises of quick victory. And each one had failed just like the ones before. And now the Dominion was sending its 4th commander with the largest fleet ever assembled for a single planetary conquest, but the humans had changed during those 5 cycles. And they were no longer the scattered and divided species that the Zenthari had first encountered. And the invasion had done something that no human government had ever managed to do. It had united them. Former enemies now fought side by side. And nations that had hated each other for centuries now shared weapons and tactics and resources. And the humans had discovered that they had far more in common with each other than they had with the aliens who wanted to enslave them. The resistance had grown from scattered groups of angry civilians into a coordinated global network, and they had learned to manufacture weapons from the debris of destroyed Zenthari equipment. And they had reverse-engineered alien technology with a speed that terrified Dominion scientists. They should not be able to do this, one Zenthari engineer reported after examining a human-built plasma rifle. This technology took us 200 years to develop, and they have copied it in less than 3. And they have even made improvements that we did not think of. But technology was not the only way humans were adapting. And they had also developed tactics that exploited every weakness in Zenthari psychology. The Zenthari needed clear chains of command to function effectively. And so the humans targeted officers and leaders with ruthless precision. And they learned to identify high-ranking Zenthari by subtle differences in their armor and behavior. And they would sacrifice entire units just to kill a single commander. The Zenthari could not function well without rest periods, and their biology required them to enter a dormant state every 40 hours. And so the humans attacked constantly at all hours, never giving the Zenthari forces a moment of peace. And human soldiers worked in shifts so that someone was always fighting while others slept. The Zenthari were rigid in their battle plans and struggled to adapt when situations changed. And so the humans became masters of chaos and unpredictability. And they would feint one direction and attack from another. And they would retreat and then suddenly turn and charge. And they would use tactics that made no military sense just because they knew the Zenthari would not expect them. But the true horror of fighting humans was something that the Zenthari had never encountered before. And it was the human relationship with time. Zenthari lived for 600 cycles on average. And they considered this a reasonable lifespan. And they fought wars carefully because each soldier represented decades of training and experience that could not be easily replaced. Humans lived for less than 100 cycles. And many did not even reach 80, and they considered this completely normal. And this fundamental difference in lifespan changed everything about how the two species approached conflict. A Zenthari soldier wanted to survive the war and return to a long life of peace. And they would retreat when casualties became too high. And they would surrender when victory became impossible. Because there was always tomorrow to fight again. A human soldier knew that their life was short regardless of what happened. And they knew that they might die of old age before the war ended. And so they fought with an urgency and a desperation that the Zenthari could not match. And surrender meant nothing to someone who was already racing against their own mortality. They fight like they are already dead. One Zenthari commander transmitted to headquarters before his position was overrun by human forces. And you cannot frighten someone who has already accepted death. And you cannot threaten someone who considers their own extinction a normal part of life. The transmission ended with the sounds of plasma fire and human war cries. And the commander was never heard from again by the 7th cycle. Commander Vrethax, who had promised victory in 3 rotations, could no longer face the reality of what was happening. And he performed the ritual suicide that Zenthari tradition demanded of failed leaders. And his last words were recorded for posterity. "I was wrong about everything," he said. "And we were all wrong, and we thought we were invading a weak and divided species. But we were actually waking something terrible by the 10th cycle. The Zenthari Dominion did something it had never done in its entire history. It formally withdrew from a conquest. The retreat was disguised as a strategic redeployment, and the official records stated that Earth had insufficient strategic value to justify continued occupation. But everyone who had served on that planet knew the truth. The humans had broken the unbreakable, and they had defeated the undefeatable, and they had done it not with superior weapons or greater numbers or advanced technology, but with nothing more than their own stubborn refusal to accept defeat after the withdrawal. The Dominion erased all records of Earth's location from every database, and they declared the entire region forbidden space. And they made it a capital crime for any Zenthari ship to enter that sector of the galaxy. But the survivors of that war could not forget, and they told their children and their grandchildren about the small blue world and the terrifying creatures who lived there. And those stories spread through the galaxy like a plague of whispers. Do not go to Earth, they warned. And do not make contact with the humans, because they are not like other species. And they do not think like other species. And they will never stop fighting you, no matter how long it takes or how much it costs. The Zenthari had found something worse than death on that unremarkable planet orbiting an unremarkable star. And they had found a species that wanted to fight, a species that found meaning in struggle, a species that looked at impossible odds and felt something that no other species in the galaxy felt. The Zenthari had felt fear when they saw those odds, but the humans had felt excitement, and that was why the galaxy would learn to fear them. Young Delegate Yanara finished reading the last file in the classified archives, and her hands were trembling so badly that she could barely control them. And her skin had gone completely pale as all the color drained from her bioluminescent cells. She had started reading with skepticism and curiosity, and she had expected to find exaggerated stories and military excuses for a failed campaign. But instead, she had found something far worse. She had found the truth. The humans were not pathetic, and they were not weak, and they were not primitive. And everything that had made them seem harmless was actually what made them the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever produced. High Arbiter Zolmanti watched her with ancient eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall, and he could see the understanding dawning on her face. And he spoke gently, because he remembered when he too had first learned about humanity. "Now you understand," he said, and his crystalline body chimed softly with each word. "And now you know why we are afraid." Yanara looked up from the display terminal with new eyes. Eyes that had seen the face of true terror. "They broke the Zenthari Dominion," she whispered, and her voice was barely audible. "And they did it without advanced weapons. And they did it without proper ships. And they did it with nothing but their own bodies and minds and will." "Yes," the High Arbiter confirmed. "And the Zenthari were just the first, because 17 other civilizations have independently discovered humanity since then. And every single one of them has chosen to avoid contact rather than risk conflict." He gestured around the great chamber. "Look at the delegates gathered here, and you will see species that have fought each other for millions of years, and species that have nothing in common except their sentience. And yet all of them agree on one thing: humanity is not to be provoked." Yanara stood on shaking legs and walked back to her seat. And the other junior delegates looked at her with concern, because they had never seen her so disturbed. And she did not have the words to explain what she had learned. The High Arbiter continued speaking to the assembled council. "The humans are not evil," he said. And this surprised many of the delegates who expected him to condemn the species. And that is precisely what makes them so dangerous, because they believe in things like justice and fairness and protecting the weak. He paused to let his words sink in. "A human will cross the galaxy to rescue a single friend, and a human will hold a grudge for generations over a perceived wrong. And a human will sacrifice everything they have to defend someone they love." The chamber was completely silent. "If we accept them into the Galactic Union, They will bond with other species the way they bond with their own kind, and they will become protective of their allies. And they will fight for those allies with the same terrifying determination that they showed against the Zenthari. He looked around the room at each species represented. They will become the most powerful force in the galaxy, because they will have both the will to fight and the resources of the Union behind them. And nothing will be able to stand against them. The delegates murmured among themselves, and some nodded in agreement, and others looked thoughtful. But the High Arbiter continued, and his voice carried a warning. If we reject them, we will make enemies of a species that holds grudges for generations and crosses the void for vengeance. And we will give them a reason to unite against us. And we will become the target of that terrible determination. He spread his crystalline arms wide. There is no safe option here. And there is only the question of which kind of humanity we want to face. Humanity as friend, or humanity unleashed. The senior delegate of the Drogoth warriors rose from his seat, and he was the largest being in the chamber, a creature of muscle and armor who had conquered 100 worlds. And his voice rumbled like distant thunder. I have studied the human military traditions, he said, and I have found something that troubles me deeply. And it is a concept they call the last stand. He paused, searching for words to explain. When a human force is surrounded and outnumbered and facing certain death, they do not surrender, and instead they fight harder than ever before. And they consider it honorable to die taking as many enemies with them as possible. He shook his massive head. My people are warriors, and we have faced many enemies, but we have never faced an enemy who becomes more dangerous when they are losing. And I do not wish to create such an enemy. The chamber erupted in debate, and species argued with each other in dozens of languages, and the translation systems struggled to keep up with the flood of words. Finally, the High Arbiter called for silence. We must vote, he announced, and we must decide whether to accept or reject humanity's request for membership. And we must live with the consequences of our choice. The voting began, and each species registered their decision, and the numbers appeared on the central display for all to see. And the count grew closer and closer until the final vote was cast. The result appeared on the screen, and the chamber fell silent. Humanity had been accepted into the Galactic Union by a margin of 3 votes. The High Arbiter nodded slowly, and his light flickered in patterns that suggested both hope and fear. Then, it is decided, he said, and we have chosen to make friends of humanity rather than enemies. And we must now welcome them properly. He turned to the chamber's communication systems. Open the doors and invite the human ambassador to enter. The massive doors at the far end of the chamber began to open, and light streamed through the widening gap. And a single figure walked into the chamber with confident steps. She was small by galactic standards, and her body was soft and fragile without any natural armor or weapons. And she wore simple clothing that offered no protection. And she carried no visible weapons of any kind. And yet every single delegate in that chamber, from the smallest to the largest, from the oldest to the youngest, felt a shiver of fear as she approached. Ambassador Sarah Chun of Earth walked to the central platform with a smile on her face, and her eyes moved across the assembled delegates with an expression that was friendly but also calculating. And she raised one hand in a gesture of greeting. Thank you for this opportunity, she said, and her voice was warm and genuine. And humanity is honored to join the Galactic Union, and we look forward to working alongside all of you. She paused and looked around the chamber with those predator eyes that saw everything and missed nothing. We believe that together we can build something wonderful, and we believe that friendship between species is possible, and we believe that the galaxy can be a better place for everyone. Her smile widened, and for just a moment, Yanara caught a glimpse of something ancient and fierce behind that friendly expression. We are so excited to meet all of you. Ambassador Chun continued, "And we cannot wait to learn about your worlds and your cultures and your people." She clasped her hands together in a gesture of enthusiasm. After all, we humans love making new friends, and in that moment, every being in the chamber understood that the galaxy had just changed forever, and that nothing would ever be the same again, and that they had just invited the most dangerous species in existence to become their allies. The age of humanity had begun, and the galaxy would never forget this day.